Good afternoon and welcome to From Modernizing Our Use of Grouper to Provisioning with midPoint and Developing Standard Populations. This is the February edition of IAM Online. We appreciate you joining us. This is the monthly webinar series focused on identity and access management, brought to you by InCommon and Internet 2. As we're getting underway, I'm going to turn things over to our moderator, but please note the following. This event is being recorded and the recording will be posted along with our slides at the IAM Online website on the incommon.org website. You will also receive a link to the recording and slides via email as well. So once again, we are recording this afternoon. We would like to hold questions until the end of today's presentation. But please post them using the Zoom Q&A function. You should see that on your dashboard there. We'll be taking questions using the Zoom Q&A function. The chat will be an area for attendees and others to post comments for group discussion, but we will be managing Q&A through the Zoom Q&A function. And once again, we are recording the webinar and you will receive a link to the recording via email, and it'll also be posted online. Without further ado, I'd like to turn the virtual podium over to our moderator for this afternoon, Erik Coleman, the IAM architect at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign.
Thanks. Thank you, April. Thanks for having me on this very exciting topic as we, like many other institutions, are adopting and embracing the InCommon Trusted Access platform to build upon our IAM infrastructure. Our speakers joining us today are from the University of Wisconsin-Madison IAM team. We have Abrianna, Barca, Associate Director for Identity and Access Management, Ryan Larscheid, IAM Technical Lead, Oaks Dobson, the IAM Engineer, and Andrew Palmer, also IAM Technical Lead. And today they plan to share their strategy and methodologies for 3 of their recent efforts, migrating Grouper from on-premise to the cloud using AWS, which was an outcome of their interoperability transformation initiative. Also implementing midPoint as a mechanism for central provisioning, deprovisioning for their campus stakeholders, as well as their policy work for defining standard populations for campus constituents and migrating services to use those. And speaking as a pure Big Ten institution here at Illinois, we are definitely following Wisconsin's footsteps, both with Grouper and midPoint as well. So I am eager to learn what they have. So with that, I hand it over to Abrianna and company.
Thanks so much, Erik. Hopefully y'all can see my screen just fine. Okay, thanks, Erik. Well, thank you all for attending today. We're really looking forward to sharing our journey and work and engaging in Q&A with all of you. We know we obviously have limited time. We've included our contact information at the end of the presentation, so do feel free to reach out to us if you'd like to connect further on these topics. We always enjoy connecting with others in the community. In terms of our agenda today, Erik did a great rundown of just kind of what we're going to do. Figured just visually it's helpful for people to be able to see this as well. I'll introduce just kind of who we've got here, as well as the Identity and Access Management team and how we're organized at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We'll talk about our interoperability initiative. This is essentially the sort of umbrella initiative that we've bucketed these 3 pieces under. I'll pass it to Ryan to talk more about how we've moved Grouper from on-prem to the cloud, why we did that, and sort of some of the nuts and bolts of it. Then Oaks Dobson and myself will talk about standardizing populations and migrating services to use those new standards. And finally, Andrew will talk about how we're implementing midPoint. So again, really looking forward to the discussion today. On our next slide, it just breaks down a little bit more about our team. We know this is a common question that inevitably we're all sort of tasked with when we think about how do we best organize our teams to get work done. And so we were asked to speak a little bit about how we're organized and what this work looks like. The scope for the Identity and Access Management team at the University of Wisconsin-Madison does include work not only for University of Wisconsin-Madison, but also work for the University of Wisconsin system, which is comprised of 13 different 4-year institutions. We're a team of 21 people organized into sub-teams. And I'll just do a quick run through of kind of how we're organized in terms of the sub-teams, again, just to orient you to the work that we're doing and how this particular project fits in. So working left to right, the first bucket is our provisioning and eligibility team. This is obviously going to be where we focus the discussion today. I've called out where our presenters sit in the organization. For others, I've just left it as noted as engineers or technical leads or service leads as appropriate. The one other piece in addition to midPoint and Grouper that sits within this team, though, is our Person Hub service, which is our homegrown identity repository for both UW-Madison and UW systems. I just wanted to call that out. You see that listed again in terms of the staffing in that space. The next bucket of teams within our space is our experiences team. This team is really focused on implementing Salesforce Experience Cloud as a platform to allow constituents the opportunity to view and assert their identity data. Really, we're trying to build out more personalized experience for students, faculty, staff, and affiliates. And so there's been a lot of work in this space, though we're still very much in implementation mode. I will talk about this on the next slide when we just briefly mention interoperability, since it's one of the other pillars of our interoperability initiative. The next team is our Active Directory team. We are actively working on helping to secure distributed departmental domains or forests, in addition to consolidating when and where it makes sense. So again, obviously, both Active Directory and Azure Active Directory are the main technologies there for that team. Continuing to move left to right, we've got a support specialist who helps to triage and just manage cases that are escalated from the help desk, also constantly working to improve documentation and self-service capabilities. And finally, underpinning that is our foundations team. It's intentionally drawn in this long rectangle because it does underpin a lot of the technologies for the teams that sit above it. The team is focused on login infrastructure and just more generally our infrastructure holistically. We think about monitoring, changes, orchestrations, kind of all of those pieces fit within there. And that's, again, where Ryan is the technical lead. Just two other quick notes. We also have a part-time overarching technical lead, as well as a full-time IAM manager that I work closely with to manage half of the team. So just wanted to, again, give a little bit of exposure to how we're organized. Our team did do a reorganization in May 2021 to just be organized in a more strategic manner. At that point, we were a pretty flat structure. So just kind of noting that that's something that we continue to work through and are excited about sort of these structures and what it's allowed our teams to be able to accomplish. Again, most of the focus in this case is going to be, of course, in that provisioning and eligibility bucket. I will also just take one more second to note that we have been engaging Unicon as a partner in this work to move Grouper to the cloud and implementing midPoint. So certainly always happy to connect on that as well. So while they're not, of course, represented on our org chart as a contractor, but they've definitely been a really great partner. All right. So as mentioned, the Interoperability Initiative is a major project that all of the work that we're going to discuss today falls within. The work of the Interoperability Initiative is spread across a couple of different teams, all within our parent department called Application Infrastructure Services. You can see here there's a really high-level mission statement. It was intentionally kept broad to allow us to roll these 4 distinct goals underneath this one umbrella. Reason for having this interoperability initiative and sort of the work is to help manage and report up progress for stakeholders, also to manage asks around resources, staffing, budget, and RFP processes that we've gone through as part of all of this. So just quickly to highlight the 4 goals, the first goal focuses on our integration systems. So a lot of this really does come down to implementing a couple of different tools. One we've implemented is Informatica Intelligent Cloud Service, or IICS, for more of that ETL platform. And then the team that's working on this has also been implementing an API program using Google Apigee. And there's been some really good efforts as well, I should note, to have better documentation to allow for more self-service and use of tools around integrating institutional data. Notably, this work falls outside of our identity and access management team. So I mention it just again as we try to kind of give some context behind all of this work. The next bucket is the identity and access management systems that confer access to the right people, right time, right systems. This is, of course, central to our discussion today. Again, the biggest pieces of work are the 3 pieces we'll talk about today, which is moving Grouper to the cloud. This is the first service our IAM team is running in AWS, so it's also been really helpful to open the door to future potential service migrations, again, where appropriate as always. We've worked a lot on our standardizing populations. We'll talk about that. And obviously, we're in the process of implementing midPoint and also using Azure application provisioning where appropriate. So again, thinking about kind of right tool for the right use case. The third goal listed here is user experience. So this is really focused on implementing that Salesforce Experience Cloud. This is partnered between our identity and access management team and our web platforms and services team, who does a lot more front-end development, UX type work. Again, a lot of it is trying to help improve access to people's own identity data across a wide range of roles. And then finally, that last goal is security. With this, it's really just baked into the other three goals. We don't have specific products we're standing up or specific initiatives. It's more, how do we help to make sure that each of those three things that sit above it are baking security, and again, as we go versus sort of at the end. At this stage, we're mostly working to wind down the formal work of our interoperability initiative and moving more into a migration phase, really where we're leveraging the infrastructure and services that we've been standing up and have added to our portfolio to actually add value to the institution. So I'll pause there. That hopefully gives you some sort of orientation to the work that we're going to talk about today. And with that, I will hand it off to my colleague, Ryan, to talk more about the migration itself.
Hello. So as Abrianna mentioned, moving Grouper from our on-prem data centers to the cloud is one of the first big AWS migrations that the IAM team has made. I guess still it's the only one. So I've listed here what kind of the initial state that we migrated from was. We started this migration project a while ago. It took, I think, between all the other initiatives that we had and this, it took almost 2 years, I think, to actually move it, though things started to speed up at the end once we had learned enough about AWS to feel confident about moving forward. So that's why on-prem, the initial status was we were running Grouper 2.4, which was installed by hand onto some VMs. There was a lot of system packages involved. So the system Apache web server, the system Shibboleth daemon, system Java. So a lot of things were kind of entangled into the machine, a lot of manual stuff. And our on-prem databases were Oracle-based. And one thing I didn't list here is that we also do some roll-up jobs, like all current employees, things like that. And those are done using Perl scripts that interact with the web services. So we also had system Perl, system install modules. It was kind of a mess. And then, as Abrianna mentioned, we have the homegrown person repository. And when we make group data available to customers, it's via that. So that is pulling data. It was pulling data directly from the grouper tables into its own database over an Oracle database link. So we don't actually have customers connecting directly to the grouper database. We don't have grouper provisioning anything out. We were pulling the membership data directly from the grouper tables. And so we encountered some issues, primarily performance-based. So when, as many of you are probably aware, when we change from one semester to another, those who are using Grouper, that is sometimes a dramatic event. And the last time this went really poorly, term changeover started on a Sunday and the processing didn't finish until Friday, which was really not good. So we did try to do some things to intervene to try and make this easier. We created what we called a fuzzy mode, where in the week prior to term changeover, we would start to add the memberships for next term into like the currently enrolled students groups. And then after that term changeover switch at midnight, we would then spend the next 2 weeks, I think, because deletes were slower, to remove all of those people that were now in the past term from the current group. So that helped ameliorate the like processing delays, but it still was some manual stuff. We still do this, but as you'll see, we've had some performance improvements since moving to the cloud, and we might end up letting Grouper just do this on its own in the future. And additionally, adding large members to groups would take a long time. Like adding all current employees to a group could take an hour or longer. And so like the UI would just time out, and then eventually it would succeed, or worse, a user might try to run it again and we might end up with deadlocks. So that wasn't good. And then because of how everything was maintained manually between the machines, it was very difficult to ensure that the configuration was consistent between the environments, or even between different instances in the same environment. Next slide, please. So our desired state was to run Grouper in AWS in Docker containers. We had been running other services in IAM in Docker containers, dozens of services actually at that point in Docker containers, but Grouper was one of the last ones to move. And for running the database in the cloud, we were going to switch from Oracle to Postgres. Seemed like a nice transition from Oracle to Postgres, and also with our plans to run midPoint, with Postgres being the only supported database for later versions of midPoint, that made sense. And then also, we wanted to manage all of the Grouper infrastructure using infrastructure as code. So configuration in Git, products like Terraform to maintain it and manage it, so that we don't have people doing things by hand and introducing those potential differences again. So that was the, yeah, so I kind of jumped to the goals. So yeah, consistent, repeatable deployment. So like you make changes in Git, you can see what's changed when, by who, there'll be messages along with it. So you're not logging in, walking into an environment in the middle of an outage, wondering why anything is the way it is. There's no messages anywhere. And then also being able to take advantage of some of the things that the cloud offers. So on-prem, our VMs were the size that they were. VMs are run by a separate team from us. Our database is also run by a separate team from us. So didn't really have the self-service ability to try like, well, we're seeing some processing delay. What if we double the CPU, double the memory? That's not a one-click operation, at least not for us. We have to open a ticket with another team. Same for database stuff. We want to try, what if we change like the IO behavior or tweak a database parameter? Like that's not something we can just try and then roll back if it didn't work. We'd have to open some tickets, so it's a little slower. And then the other advantage, especially that we've been using a lot now with our learnings about midPoint, is the ability to create a local development environment for testing Grouper functionality and upgrades. So most of the development that we do these days, we initially do on our machines ourselves, which is really nice. Next slide, please. So, so the first step that we did for moving to the cloud was create the local development environment. So it uses Docker containers with Docker Compose. There's a Docker container for Grouper. There's Docker containers for the Postgres database. And then for some of the other pieces that we used, like the application load balancer, there are some containers that you can get like traffic that you can configure to emulate the behavior of that. So we were able to work on creating a Docker container image and configurations and learn about how all these pieces would work safely on our machines without having to worry about colliding with each other or having to do like making a mistake and then having like, oh, well, now we have to recreate the database in AWS and that takes 20 minutes or something like that. You can quickly just drop the volume, start again. So we took advantage of the Grouper 2.5 Docker image that was created for ITAP. We don't use the image directly. We do appreciate all the changes that were made to Grouper to make it easier to run it in a container. That was great. One of the goals that we wanted to do was decouple applying updates to Java, Tommy, and Grouper. So the way we have it working right now is that the Java and the Tommy updates happen automatically. So every quarter when Oracle has their cumulative patch updates, we pull that in, we just update Java, but we don't have to worry about if like maybe we weren't ready to move to the next point release of or revision of Grouper at the same time. We can kind of decouple those two things. And because we plan to use the application load balancer, we didn't need the web server or the shibboleth service provider that also comes inside the ITAP container, but we still build from the ITAP container. So we do like a Docker multi-stage build and we extract all the Grouper binaries out of the ITAP image. So still definitely taking advantage of the effort that was put into creating those images. So once we got working on that image, we were configuring it to kind of be agnostic as to whether it was running on-prem or in the cloud. So we ended up configuring everything with environment variables because that's how we knew we were going to run it in the cloud. And eventually we got to the point where the only difference between the on-prem image and the cloud image was the logging configuration, because we didn't have something like CloudWatch logs on-prem. So we had it logging to disk on-prem, but that was the only difference. Everything else was configured exactly the same. which was great because it reduced the number of changes that we were going to have to worry about what was changing when we moved to the cloud. Because in this case, it was just the logging configuration, which in the Docker Compose environment, we could confirm that indeed Grouper did output the logs to console. So we were good to go. So once we had the image set up and we were running it on-prem, sort of, I guess, in parallel, we started creating the AWS environment in which this would run. And this is where there was a lot of upfront learning that we had to do. We had to learn about AWS. There's a lot of documentation out there, not all of it from AWS, but sometimes it's difficult to get the whole story. You have to look at their documentation, look at their blog posts, look at other people's blog posts about their services to kind of get the full story about things. We also had to learn how to use Terraform. So that's the product that we chose for managing the infrastructure as code. So we can define the desired state of the infrastructure, and then Terraform will log into the AWS via the APIs, inspect the current state, and then present us with a plan about how to get from the current state to our desired state, and then we can approve it and it'll apply it. So that's been really great. And then we run those pipelines monthly. Even if nothing has changed, we run them on the first Monday of every month just to see if any drift has potentially been introduced by somebody maybe doing something with the console. So it's also great for detecting drift as well if the infrastructure starts to deviate from the desired state. All of our code is in our GitLab instance that's run by our shared tools team on campus. And then we're using Jenkins for the automated deployments. So it's running all the pipelines for us. We have a couple generic functions, like one called like Docker build or one called Terraform deploy. And it runs the same steps every time, regardless of which project it is. So that's really nice. And so for the technologies, we use RDS Postgres for the database. We had looked at Aurora, but I got worried about the IO costs because they charge you per IO, and we had no idea how much IO Grouper would actually do in Postgres. And they had like an embarrassing where not in, they did the same thing as in or something a while back. So we might take a look at it soon because there's some interesting stuff with serverless v2, because all databases generally, especially our Grouper one, has a lot of spiky workloads. So the ability to scale up and scale down might be nice. Right now we're over provisioned to deal with certain spiky tasks. For the Docker containers, we chose Fargate. Didn't want to have to manage any EC2 instances if we could help it, and currently we don't have to. Fargate allows you to just say how many vCPUs, how much memory do you need, and how many of these things do you want it to run, and it takes care of it for you. And then we use the application load balancer both for balancing, routing the traffic, and then also for the OpenID Connect configuration. So we didn't need to use the shibboleth service provider and maintain some additional secrets or anything like that with the SP private keys. Next slide, please. So once we had the environment running, so we had our database running, we had access to modify the database. We then tried migrating the data up to the cloud. We used the database migration service from AWS. It has the ability to apply schema, but we chose to not do that because Grouper helpfully provided Postgres DDL for us. So we just apply that and just migrate the data itself instead. So we migrated the data, just the tables and primary keys. We didn't do any secondary indexes, even with 150 gigabytes, I think, of data before indexing for production. That only took like an hour to migrate, which is great because then we could test the migration a few times, which we ended up doing. And then once that was migrated, then we'd create all those secondary indexes, foreign keys, constraints, things like that, and the views. And then we were able to start Grouper and do some testing. We did identify a few things that needed to be modified. If anybody's curious, I can go into more details at another time, but we had to set the random page cost to 1.1, which is recommended by Postgres for SSDs. I think it defaulted to 4, which is more appropriate for spinning disks. And then we also had to set the plan cache mode to force custom plan, because I think in this case, it was like every entity user inside a Grouper had permissions to like 70,000 groups. And so that resulted in a bad plan getting cached, because I think that was the entity that caused a bad plan to get cached, because the plan for querying 70,000 entities, I think, was the one that got cached. So that caused a lot of performance problems. But we ran the production Grouper with no customers attached to it in production for a week prior to the actual cutover. So we were able to identify all these issues without affecting any data, and we're able to apply those two changes. After we did that, our CPU went way down. It's actually a lot lower than it was on-prem, which is interesting. I don't think we'll ever know what was wrong with Oracle, but we've been much happier with Postgres. And so then for each environment, we had a game day document with all the steps that we had to do. There were still quite a few manual steps that needed to be done, but we ran through the document for each environment at least once as a dry run. I think dev got migrated like 4 times as we were working on the document. And so then on game day, we just went through the document one step at a time. We knew our rollback plan would work because I'd already migrated production once before. I migrated it back and then migrated for real on the day of. And as I'd mentioned before, the person repository is querying the data from Grouper directly from the Grouper database using a database link. We realized that using database migration services to send the data to the cloud, we could also use it to pull the data back. So we created a new Grouper schema called AWS Grouper, created the tables we need in there, and the DMS is populating those. That also gave us a unique opportunity that the data was available in 2 schemas on the same database. So we could actually do minuses both directions between the tables after we had shut everything down prior to going live in the cloud in production to confirm that literally every single row was there and in the state that it should have been. So that took an hour to do because those tables, as you can expect, they're quite large since we did migrate 150 gigabytes of data. But yeah, if you don't have to worry about that or you don't have that opportunity, the actual migration itself will probably be about as long as it takes Fargate to start a task and DNS to expire. And that's all I have.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. So we'll transition to talking a little bit more about some of the more policy work that we've been doing alongside this technical work, which has been working towards standardizing populations and ultimately migrating services to use those new standards. So I'll kick things off with a little bit of project background, then pass it to Oaks to talk more about the migration itself. This slide we've been using to just define what service eligibility is at large and how we've talked about it within our organization. You'll see some references to Do-It services. Do-It is the division of information technology or our central IT arm that our team operates out of. Our work has really focused on standardizing populations that service owners will ultimately use. Another focus has been understanding the portfolio of services within our central IT organization. And then finally, on the far right side, the migration will focus on that final part, which is pulling those things together alongside, again, partnering with the service owners themselves. So today, service eligibility is done in a very decentralized manner, meaning that each Do-It service owner basically is making independent decisions on who should be eligible to use their service. As you might imagine, number of challenges in managing service eligibility in this way. A lot of inconsistencies in eligibility, especially for members of affiliated organizations like emeritus faculty or consultants or others as well. It's a confusing end user experience because people are gaining and losing services in an inconsistent time and manner. And to set up service eligibility well, as many attendees here are well aware of, it requires fairly in-depth knowledge of the actual business practices themselves to understand how roles and attributes work, the timing of different actions in the academic calendar, and sort of everything that goes into that. So really our overall goal is to manage service eligibility in a standard and more repeatable manner, and ensuring that uniquenesses between services are intentional and not just historical, which again, in many cases, it was kind of whoever built that group long ago was using maybe a best practice at the time versus really thinking about how do we define these populations. Again, ultimately, just really want to improve that end user experience, the help desk ability to support end users, and really make it more accessible for service owners and leads to make good decisions. Notably, there's a couple of things that are out of scope. So service owners are still going to decide who should access their service. A lot of this obviously also comes back to contracting. So they'll work with our financial services team as appropriate to ensure that their contracts cover these various populations. And then while the project in this case, again, is really just scoped to do it IT services or essential IT services, this was really intentional and has allowed us to keep this work moving forward. I know there's been past sort of starts and stops that certainly precede my time even at the institution to try to define these things. And I think they got a little bit too big and it made it really hard to build consensus. So by scoping it to say, this is the definition we're going to use for IT services, it's allowed us to move this work ahead. We do aim to create populations that could be leveraged outside and beyond, though again, sort of future looking more so than goals inherent in the initial work. To do this work, of course, has required a lot of partnerships. So we've been actively engaging with our Office of Human Resources, the Office of the Registrar, as well as sort of throughout our Do It organization, including groups like our financial services team. We've also incorporated feedback from the Office of Youth Protection, Veteran Services, School of Medicine and Public Health, and others along the way. Again, some of those really large key stakeholders who know a lot about those particular constituent groups. We've also leveraged 7 pilot Do It services. That's been really helpful to help us kind of evaluate along the way. So when we've had various drafts of things, we've been able to work and engage with those teams to say, will this work for your service? Tell us feedback and allow us to sort of respond to that feedback and continually improve and iterate as we go. So that's, again, a little bit about how we've approached the work. And again, would not have been able to do this without really strong partnerships. So again, a big part of the work that we recently completed is the creation of standard business definitions for faculty, staff, students, affiliates. And so I wanted to give you a sense of kind of how this works and what this has looked like. Again, a big goal of this is to make it easier for us to talk about these groups in a consistent way throughout our organization by actually writing down definitions and then the supporting technology. So this is just to give one example of a relatively simple population for credit students enrolled, less controversial than some of our other populations of affiliates that sit on the fringe. It's what it gives intentionally designed to give a sense of kind of how we have to construct these definitions from a data perspective to ensure students get and then ultimately maintain access to services. So again, a lot of student information system or SIS language, here in terms of how we actually look at this. But at the end of the day, really the goal is to replace all of this SIS language with a simplified business definition. So this is, again, just one example of our population definitions where we've moved away from needing to know a ton about terms and students and, student statuses in PeopleSoft, and instead just tried to move to something that's more business oriented that could be shared not only throughout our organization, but even publicly with our constituents. Again, goal is to help service owners to be able to make good decisions without having to understand every single detail. Again, needing and expecting every single service owner in central IT to understand all of that is without question a liability. We have worked through this in this type of work for 38 different populations. So on the employee end, we've got we have 26. So that includes not only versions of employees, but also affiliates. And on the student end, we've got 12. So again, a total of 38 different populations. I'll briefly just touch on kind of where we're headed next and then pass it to Oak. So we have finalized the definitions. So we're working to now, ensure that the groups are going to align to those definitions. So a little bit of technical work there, though. I think the whole team feels like easy compared to the journey we've been on to date to get to the point towards standardization. We are also drafting proposals for attestation for manually maintained groups as well as a communication plan. So the goal is to help ensure that groups that are manually maintained by administrators throughout our decentralized IT environment are attested to on an ongoing basis. We've been working with cybersecurity on that proposal and how we'll technically implement everything. There are some additional policy pieces we've been working on. We won't get into all of those today, but definitely there's some other components that we've been working on with cybersecurity. And then a lot of cleanup has been happening, especially with our HR team, as we think about some legacy populations that we have ultimately been able to move away from as appropriate. And then finally, moving towards migration. So really trying to put this work to use in terms of how we will ultimately leverage this and get value out of it as an organization. And so with that, I will pass it to Oaks to talk more about what that looks like.
Thank you. So as Abrianna touched on, the next piece that we're going to be looking at is migrating all of the Do It IT services that we offer to utilizing these standard population groups where it's possible. So a little bit of background about Do It. We are a relatively large central IT department that supports the majority of campus, including the campus-wide services. So think like Zoom, email, even the ability to like have and create a NetID. So we offer a lot of services. I think our service catalog that we completed as part of this project lists over 120 different services. So each and every one of those we're going to have to take a look at and see if they qualify for needing to migrate. So that's kind of setting the stage, so to speak. Next slide. So we're breaking the migration out into two parts, somewhat by necessity because it's going to be a lot of work, but also by necessity because we're still kind of trying to figure out how and where midPoint and Azure are going to be sitting in our environment and how we're going to be utilizing those. And more on that to come. But for the first part of this migration, the stuff that we're doing right now, we're reaching out to all of the different service owners within Do It. So say the mail team, who also happens to support Zoom, we would reach out to those service owners and leads to make decisions to potentially swap in standardized groups where possible, and then also just to try and generally improve end user experience. And one way that we're looking at doing that, so there's a number of services that still sort of exist outside of the grouper realm, like we're not utilizing grouper to its fullest extent to deliver populations for those services. So the hope is to get as many of those services that could be using grouper onto grouper as well as utilizing standard groups for those services. So that's the piece that we're going to be working on in the immediate term. During that time, we'll also be kind of trying to craft a better idea of what we want to do for part two. So utilizing things like midPoint and Azure to standardize provisioning and deprovisioning, so that we don't have to rely on like old custom scripts to deliver to provision access to a given service. So the thought there for part two is to improve automation around provisioning, again, by utilizing either Azure or midPoint. And we are currently looking for Azure early use cases, and actually just completed our first, or just used our first use case. We set up an Artifactory, our JFrog Artifactory, to provision user accounts using Azure. We fed grouper groups into our AD infrastructure, and then from AD into Azure AD, or like local AD into Azure AD, and then provisioned access via those groups. So I think that was a big win. But yeah, that's kind of future state. So, all right, I think next slide. So as far as like touching on standardized populations, I know Abrianna touched on it a little bit earlier of why we decided to do this, but to zoom out a little bit, UW-Madison has been utilizing grouper for more than a decade. And as such, a lot of different kind of basis groups have sort of popped up along the way. So for instance, maybe we would bring in application groups from our student information system, or sorry, applied students from our student information system in one way, but then we decided, okay, we didn't bring in enough detail, so we're going to make another loader. So we're going to bring in that same group of populations, but with more detail in another loader. So now all of a sudden we have two sets of basis groups that sort of do the same thing. So the idea there was to sort of cut back on any of the older, or any use of the older or legacy basis groups, and ultimately get rid of those to kind of help with why can't I think of the word? Oh, performance, with grouper performance. I mean, the more groups you have, the more you can take a performance hit when you make a change. And then also just to make it simpler for us when we're building a population, we want to make sure that we know exactly where to go. We're not going to like 6 different places to get the same thing. We'd rather go to one spot. So standardizing populations helped us in a number of ways, not just to have a standard definition out there, but also in terms of performance, and to just clean up an application that we've been using for a very long time. So again, the thought there is to simplify where we can and deliver those populations into one spot. So essentially bring in the basis groups and then set up that reference group layer so that we're only using kind of one set of reference groups rather than, again, multiple reference groups throughout that were set up throughout different integrations or as we brought on different applications. Just really trying to simplify it so we know exactly where to go to get a population. Again, that helps us with tracking our population definitions because we have those written down and codified. But then at the end of the day, you might have services that do still require some additional tweaking or customization. But we're just going to try to use more standardized building blocks, again, that are found in that same sort of reference group folder, rather than kind of bringing in different stuff from either basis groups or old legacy reference groups. So that's been our goal, and I think that we've made significant strides in cutting back on duplicate groups and also getting those standard populations set up. So yeah, next slide. I think now is where I would hand it over to Andrew to talk a little bit about the part 2 of the migration, specifically with midPoint and Azure.
Hey, yeah, thank you, Oaks. As Oaks and Abrianna mentioned, the eligibility front is largely decentralized, and the same is true on the provisioning front. Office 365 service owner handles provisioning for Office 365, same with Zoom and many other services. The same can be said about IAM. We've built our own internal tools for provisioning from the Person Hub to Active Directory and our other services. In this diagram, RegSync kind of fills that role. We do, as Oaks mentioned, offer Azure AD provisioning, and we've started to complete some of our initial use cases there, and we plan to expand adoption there. Next slide gets more into the future state, where we plan on leveraging midPoint initially to offset RegSync for our internal processes, but the long-term goal is to offer a combination of midPoint and Azure to service owners for any of their provisioning needs. midPoint, I know, isn't great for provisioning for services that only use SCIM, for example, and Microsoft makes a lot of bespoke specific integrations to services that's easy to set up. So depending on what's the easiest or the right tool, we will pick either midPoint or Azure for that service. Going a little bit behind the curtains on the next slide, we can kind of show what work we're doing right now. In the current and recent sprints on the midPoint front, we've been working on setting up our Person Hub connector using the midPoint scripted SQL connector. We are also establishing a baseline configuration for getting grouper groups into midPoint. Unicon has provided a connector for getting groups into midPoint, and we are hoping to use the official Evolvium connector when that comes out. In the future with midPoint, we plan on getting LifeSync working and then finally offering provisioning to service owners. For Azure, as Oaks mentioned, we've implemented some of our initial use cases, but in the future, we plan on formalizing the offering and documenting it so that people who are interested in using it can find information about it, and we can just increase onboarding for Azure provisioning. And then for midPoint, we don't only plan on using it for provisioning. On the next slide, we talk a little bit about how we want to use it for some access management things. Access management at UW-Madison is largely ad hoc. Some units do have their own access request system. For example, our HRS people do. Other people use Grouper for access management, but it's largely ad hoc. There's no access request portion. And midPoint has a really robust feature set around that. And so we plan on also offering the ability to create roles or entitlements that people can request, and then have policies for attestation and all the good security stuff around it. I think that's the majority of what I wanted to touch on the midPoint front.
Awesome. Well, we nailed the timing, team, so good job. We wanted to leave about 15 minutes to go through any potential questions. Again, as invited at the beginning, please do feel free to contact us. We know our time is limited, so we're not going to get too in-depth or be able to address any questions, so we've included that here. But I think with that, I'll pass it back to our host, Erik, to potentially walk us through some questions and discussion.
Sure thing. Yeah, there's a few that came in here. Let me start off with Andy Morgan at Ohio State asked, curious how you interacted with the business offices to establish those new population definitions. They're going through that effort too, and it's hard to get the governance groups up to speed on this work.
Yeah, I can definitely speak to that. Where we decided to head with this is interacting with those business offices individually. So just kind of working within some current partnerships that I had to set up some regular standing discussions where we could keep working through this in an iterative manner. We do have some governance groups that were also in parallel being stood up. So it's hard to say, you know, a year from now, would we end up working just with those governance groups? But again, I think to the point raised in the question itself, speed was of the essence. We did want to move this ahead, and we knew that, again, waiting potentially a year to get a governance group stood up and into a good rhythm certainly would slow down that work. And so I think, again, this gives us a really strong starting point. We have scoped it to just our central IT services, so it definitely allows governance to review and, you know, make different decisions in the future. But that is sort of how we went about this work, given where the University of Wisconsin-Madison was at the time.
Great, and I apologize, that's Oregon State, and Andrew pointed out I got the OSU wrong, sorry. And then Winston Antian asked, what did you use before midPoint as far as that provisioner or deprovisioner?
Yeah, I can take that question. So provisioning is largely decentralized. We have a homegrown tool called RegSync that helps provision to Active Directory and some other internal IAM services. But we plan on using midPoint to sort of be that centralized provisioning engine.
Okay, and then let's see. Can you expand a bit about the choice or need to have both Azure and midPoint for provisioning? That was asked by Patrick Landry.
Yeah, as Abrianna mentioned, right tool for the job. We don't want to keep anything off the table. And I think I mentioned SCIM. midPoint, even midPoint's own developers admit that SCIM is kind of a mess and they don't want to deal with it. And Microsoft has some pretty decent offerings for SCIM provisioning to certain services. So whatever tool fits best is what we're going to use to provision to a given service.
Okay, and then Mike Bernard asks, do you use co-manage at all? Is Person Hub like a homegrown version of co-manage?
I can try. I'm actually not super familiar with co-manage, but the Person Hub has, like, there's data feeds from many different source systems of record, HR system, which is shared across UW system, and then every institution's student information system, and then all the affiliate systems. And so it's doing like identity matching, and then it's also like generating like entities for the users at Madison, otherwise just storing credentials for the institution. So it maybe does some of the stuff that co-manage does. I'm not sure. It started development in like 2000, so I'm not sure if that predates co-manage or not. But it has so far stood the test of time. The code that exists today is not at all the code that was there before. So we keep evolving it as the needs require.
And Mike also asked, how many total users do you have in these systems?
I think in AD, there was like 1.2 million, but that's just from Madison. There's also all the UW system stuff too. We're maintaining active identities for former students now because they are eligible for some services as alumni. So that's really expanded the number of users that need to be like actively tracked and managed at this point.
And Kevin Hickey asked, is AD the central directory service? midPoint currently provisions and deprovisions to AD with plans for Azure AD. How does that work in the grand scheme of things?
Yeah, for UW-Madison, Active Directory is kind of our primary directory service. It's where we store like most of our net ID information. We do not provision to it with midPoint today, but the long-term plan is to. And then we have some potential use cases where midPoint would also provision directly to Azure AD.
Okay. And Grady Bailey asked, is there any particular reason you decided to deploy Grouper and other such things using AWS rather than Azure's cloud offering, given that you're using Azure AD and other associated things for provisioning?
I guess for like provisioning compute, so like using Azure for their software as a service stuff like Azure AD or all the Microsoft 365 stuff, as I think it's called now. That's like one thing. We had to have Azure AD for Microsoft 365. Using it for compute, we have a group that does a lot of like .NET development. I think they're deploying things into Azure, but for the most part, I think in central IT, when provisioning like compute resources, it seems like AWS is the one that most people are using. So we decided to do that too, so that we could share knowledge, experience, and grow in that. But yeah, maybe compute in Azure will become more of a thing in the future. If like the data that is needed happens to be in Azure, then co-locating the compute in the same provider might make sense in that case.
Okay. Is your intention, Martin asks, is the intention to define groups and group memberships in Grouper and then provision those groups and memberships through midPoint, i.e. is Grouper no longer going to do any provisioning?
Yeah, our philosophy is kind of that Grouper is the brains and midPoint is the brawn. Grouper is really good at that set math, defining eligibility stuff. And so using the Grouper SQL provisioner and then the midPoint Grouper connector, we're going to pull that group information into midPoint and then actually use it for provisioning.
Okay, and then Gabor asked, as far as those basis groups that you load in, are they pushed from Person Hub versus pulled by Grouper loaders or a mix?
The basis groups, we don't actually populate any of those basis groups from loaders. We have actually a RegSync client that's doing that today. We may replace that RegSync portion with something else that's a little more slimmed down. RegSync's kind of generic, so it's got like connector like classes and stuff that we probably don't need long term once we replace everything else with midPoint. But yeah, as data changes about users in Person Hub, today RegSync gets that there's a package inside of Person Hub that will spit out the basis groups that a user should be a member of, and then RegSync interacts with the Grouper web services to add and remove those memberships from a user to true those up. So that's how the basis groups are being generated today. We do have a couple loaders that pull in certain like ancillary things about users, but like their core roles and stuff are currently managed through RegSync through the web services. I expect we'll probably keep doing that going forward because it works really well for getting data in like an incremental fashion. So like within a minute of your roles changing in Person Hub, those changes have been affected inside of Grouper. I don't think we could run the loader on all those users every minute. I don't think that would work.
So I'm curious, is RegSync a you mentioned it's using the web services API. So is it a custom thing or a third-party tool? Something we wrote?
It's a custom thing.
Okay.
It's written in Perl. So
fine.
I don't know if anybody would want that code base. But.
So let's see. Julio Polo asks, so is the Person Hub a homegrown component that you plan to keep maintaining? Are you planning to move any of the functionality such as identity matching into midpoint?
I think at the moment we plan to keep it, if for no other reason that currently our midpoint project is scoped to Madison and Person Hub is serving functionality for all of UW system. And then there's other things too, like some of the matching stuff is using kind of sensitive fields that we probably wouldn't want to put into midpoint or have midpoint even be aware of. Like perhaps like SSNs, ITINs, dates of birth, maybe I don't know if we'd have to provision those into different places, but yeah, we probably want to keep those two concerns separated. So Person Hub will just tell midpoint the data about a person. If two people end up like merging into one due to like bad data entry, like midpoint will become aware of that because Person Hub will reflect that info and then midpoint can take it from there.
And Michael Hodges asked, how many groups do you have total?
I saw that question. I pulled up, I don't know if this is actually useful. I pulled up yesterday's grouper report. I don't know what these numbers actually correspond to, but it says there's 180,000 groups and 78 million memberships. But I don't know what that means. If that's like groups of groups of groups, if those are memberships, I'm not sure. We do a lot of groups of groups of groups, which I think leads to some performance issues. That's another thing we'll be tackling hopefully this summer, just kind of flattening that stuff down so you have a fewer groups with large numbers of people as direct members. I think that'll improve some of the lingering performance issues that we're still seeing.
And speaking of performance, Milan Kumar asked, is midpoint able to handle large provisioning, deprovisioning load that would occur during term flip? Have you had any experience with that yet?
We'll find out. The mid-scale project promises that it should be able to scale to 1 million users or more. Midpoint also supports clustering, which we'll have to have some fun trying out. But that was something that with AWS, we in theory would be able to do is during certain periods of time, we could scale up to 10 midpoint instances. Also, Fargate used to be limited to like 4 CPUs and 32 gigabytes of memory or something. Those limits have been raised dramatically. I think we can have like 16 vCPUs now or something. So yeah, hopefully it can. And if it just needs more compute, running midpoint AWS will hopefully allow us to give it what it needs so it can get that done. And yes, we do plan to run midpoint in AWS. There's our dev instances is running in there right now that nobody's using it for anything. But there is a dev instance that's running out there to prove that it actually can run there.
And then David Bickle asked, do you plan to run midpoint in AWS to let it scale?
Yep. Sorry, that's the one I just answered.
Like, are you can actually use the auto scaling feature even, or like full auto scaling?
Perhaps. We haven't done that for Grouper. The trick
I'm curious how many nodes
you
run for Grouper too. Like, yeah, if you're not auto scaling, how many nodes of the daemon or the web services are you running?
We're running 2. We're currently in 2 AZs because we're using RDS with multi-AZ, which at the moment could only be in 2 AZs. If we switch to Aurora, we might bump that up to 3. I did leave gaps in the IP ranges to account for that. The problem that I've seen with auto scaling is when it scales down, like midpoint, or not midpoint, Grouper especially, you can like do a web service call that takes like an hour to return. And if a scale down event happens and kills off your container, that's depressing. So at the moment, we're just running with like a fixed 2 node capacity. And we would probably scale up the size of those. But yeah, we'll see like if midpoint can handle graceful interruptions like that better, that might be interesting.
Okay, David followed up with, out of curiosity, what specs are you currently using for it?
For Grouper, the web services, that's off the top of my head. I think the web services are 2 vCPU and 4 gigabytes of memory, maybe 8. And the daemon, I think, has 4 vCPU and 8 or 16 gigabytes of memory. Because the daemon would be doing like changelog jobs, and those are sometimes the bottleneck because I think they're single threaded.
Okay. Well, I think that wraps up. I think we're out of time for questions. So any other follow-ups, you can contact the presenters directly. I'm going to hand it back off to April.
Thank you so much, Erik. Yes, and these final minutes that we have together, I want to thank you and our presenters for a fabulous presentation this afternoon, and to our great audience for being so engaged and asking the questions. Just want to reiterate a couple of quick items. We will be sending these slides out and as well as the recording. So keep an eye out for that. You will receive, you can go to our website probably within the next week. You'll also get an email. Please, if you have a few moments, we have a quick 4-question survey. So as you leave, we'd really appreciate it if you take a moment to provide your input. That's so helpful to us. And lastly, we'll be back next month with another great program. So please check your email and website for those details. And again, thank you to Erik and our presenters. And also thank you to our great events team here at Internet 2, Carly and Susan, who help us put this together every month, as well as their team members who help us with the marketing and promotion for IAM Online. Thank you all again, and have a great rest of the day. We'll see you next month.